Hi, I'm Beth Comstock, here for another Changemaker book club. We're live on Facebook. We're going to be taking your questions throughout the next half an hour, and I'm just delighted to have Priya Parker, who has written a beautiful book in every sense of the word. Beautifully written, beautiful message. It's about the art of gathering. I'm going to take a minute and remind you what we do with the Changemaker book club. This is about a gathering of sorts. It's a virtual and a physical gathering. We're here at WeWork in New York City. So there's a lot of milling around, but we started this a year ago as a way to bring business people together, to gather them, to share insights that may help them navigate change, innovate, frankly just lead forward. So we're delighted, Priya. So congrats on the book.
Thank you.
Let's just start off. Tell us why you wrote the book. Why we have enough gatherings. Why do we need a book about it?
So I wrote the book in part because I was frustrated with the type of wisdom and advice that have come from, frankly, generations earlier about the assumptions of what make gatherings work. And if you look at kind of what, like, I jokingly call it the gathering industrial complex, the majority of
I know those.
You know
people.
those, right?
Yeah.
The majority of books and magazines are about the things of gathering, the flowers and the recipes and the crudités and the canapés and the kind of Martha Stewart style of gathering. No offense to Martha Stewart the person, but really the symbol of what that gathering actually means, which is we believe that the kind of the goal and the setup of the things at work, in work as well, PowerPoint font and the AV equipment and all the tech stuff, and we forget to actually focus on how do you connect people once they're actually in your midst.
Yeah, so a bit about Priya. Priya, you're the founder of Thrive Labs, and you were trained in conflict resolution. I thought you were just the perfect person to have a discussion with about navigating change and meaning in work.
Yeah.
We talk a lot about change, but no one can change a culture, a company, a team on their own. It's about a continual set of conflict dealing
Absolutely.
and meaningful gatherings. So I'd love you to just talk a little bit about how you got into this, how you got to be a professional gatherer.
Yeah.
How did that happen?
So I think like so many things, we kind of sort out in our work the things that we lack in our life. And I'm biracial. I grew up in two different homes. My parents were divorced, and I grew up between these two homes. Every 2 weeks they joined custody, and so every 2 weeks I'd be between a Indian, kind of vegetarian, Indian, British, liberal, Democrat, progressive home, and then I'd drive a mile, or I'd be driven a mile, west, and I entered into my father's home, which is a white American, conservative, evangelical Christian, meat-eating, kind of twice-a-week church-going home,
Yeah.
and I had to figure out how to belong to both. And so, at some level, you could sort of say I got into kind of conflict resolution because my entire life was kind of based on navigating different worlds and figuring out when two different people and worlds collide and adamantly disagree about particularly religion and things that are kind of divisive. How do you actually continue to create community, and why do people come together and why do people come apart?
This seems so important and relevant in the world we're living in now. I'm sure that's not lost on
Yes.
you or anybody as you say that.
Yeah.
Why are we seem to be in search of something with our gatherings. What does gathering mean to us as humans?
I mean, we've been gathering for as old as time. We're social animals. We're social creatures, and so gathering is not new. But I think in part because we have been focusing so much on the form of gathering, we've kind of thrown the function out of the window. And I believe that particularly the kind of next generation millennials, but also Gen X's and above, we are starting to realize that we want more meaning and we want more connection when we actually gather. And a lot of gatherings, both in the workplace and in the kind of social world, have been kind of stripped of meaning, of focusing on the things that really matter. Yeah. For this book, I interviewed over 100 different gatherers. I interviewed a choreographer from Cirque du Soleil, a rabbi, a Japanese tea ceremony master, a dominatrix.
Yeah, I thought you were very brave with the range of people you talked to.
And one of the things that I found over and over again was that they really focused on how do you actually create heat? How do you, one of the characters I interviewed is a woman named Ida Benedito, and she creates these sort of amazing underground experiences in New York City. And the question that she asked, she and her business partner asked before every experience that they create is, what is this group of people avoiding? And
that's such a great question in general.
It's such a great question.
Yeah.
And what is the risk in facing it? And what is the gift in facing it? And if you just ask that simple question before every meeting, even if you decide not to face it, it will transform your meetings.
So say that again.
So what is this group of people avoiding? And what is the risk in facing it?
Yeah.
And is it worth, and what is the gift?
Yeah.
And is it worth the risk?
Well, I love that. So hopefully you're not avoiding asking some questions for Priya. A reminder, we're taking questions live. Many of you have given us questions already on LinkedIn and Twitter and Facebook. We'll be surfacing those up. You talk about, you have this great line, you say, make purpose your bouncer. And talk about purpose and how does one find their purpose in what they're gathering. We think, well, we have to meet, we have a project, we have a client, we're having a wedding. But you're saying that's not enough.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the problems with so many meetings, particularly in the workplace, and any type of meeting or gathering where we have an assumption of what it has to look like, is that we skip asking, why are we actually meeting? So for a wedding or a birthday party, because we have an image in our mind of what it looks for, we skip to form. With board meetings, because we have an image of what it needs to look like, we skip to form, and we don't actually say, what does this group need now? And what this group may need now might be to spend time in a cemetery. I mean, I'm making this up, but it doesn't necessarily have to be kind of like sitting and behaving and playing the roles that are often associated with the forms that we consider.
So how do you, when a client comes to you, you've worked with a range of organizations from activists to corporations to nonprofits, right?
Yep.
When someone comes and says, we want to do this kind of gathering, just do it, and you say no, like how does that, do a little role playing, how does that work if I come to you and say, I want to do it this way, and you go, no, it's not going to work for you?
Yeah. So somebody might come to me and say, we want to get this group of people together, and I'm trying to think of an example that I can actually share. We want to get a group of people in the food movement together, and for 2 days, 70 people, and talk about the future of sustainable food. So that's a good purpose at some level. But getting 70 people and trying to figure out what to actually do with them, you need to dig a little bit deeper. Are you trying to focus on the areas of disagreement and come to alignment? Is the purpose to just build trust? And is the purpose to talk about the parts of the food system that are problematic? Is the purpose to talk about the kind of the heat in the room? And if it's the heat, then you should be bringing together farmers, people from Pepsi and people from the school systems, and get in the room, design it based on people who have literally protested each other's meetings. That's interesting. Right? And so
that's hard.
It is hard. But part of, people show up to meetings and gatherings when you have a specific purpose, when they feel that they make sense to be there for that purpose, and when you talk about the things that matter in a safe, and kind of facilitated way.
So one of the questions that came in, this is from Kimberly Butterworth, and it came in via LinkedIn. And Kimberly says, what's the optimal approach for meeting attendee creep? This idea that we have too many people who show up in meetings, and you can't leave anyone out. Clients want to bring 800 people. The company wants to bring 800 people to the client meeting, and it gets unmanageable, and you lose sight of your purpose.
Totally.
You're very strict about this.
Yes.
Talk to us about that.
I love this question. It's a great question, and I love the framing as it's creeping. Basically, your purpose should be very, very deeply connected to who you invite. And one of the things that I think is a sort of age-old adage that has ruined a lot of our gatherings is the idea of the more the merrier, or that we should be radically inclusive. If someone wants to be there, who are we to say no? And the value that I like behind that is a spirit of generosity. But it's misunderstood of who are you being generous to. You should be generous to your purpose, and you should be generous to the people that are fulfilling that purpose. And by allowing anyone to come out of obligation or anything else, you're diluting your purpose. And so I'll give an example. Sometimes when clients want to bring extra people, it is actually very helpful. So I was facilitating a meeting with a client that was wanted to build a new city. And
sounds like a big meeting.
It's a big meeting. And they brought together 12 people from around the world who are kind of radical thinkers in different ways. Bollywood, film director to, a park planner, to a video game designer. And they wanted to basically, at the last minute, the client wanted to bring, 30 more people from their company. And in that case, we said yes. And we said, because of this project, you're going to have bold ideas, and in any type of dynamic, you have bold ideas in the beginning, and then like the lawyers come and the accountants come, and it kind of gets flattened over time. And so in this case, we wanted to have as wide of a group involved, not witnessing these exciting ideas, so that they got excited in the beginning and their mindset changed from, well, I wasn't part of that, to how can we make this happen? And so, but we used them very specifically. They weren't allowed to talk. And we changed the format and the design of the meeting where the people who were there to kind of share their ideas sat in a circle in a fishbowl style. And then all of the listeners sat around them in a huge circle, and they weren't allowed to be on their phones.
Such a good example. We were having a bit of a thread and a debate on LinkedIn this morning about, should you come to a meeting if you're not going to participate? Well, what's your view of that? I mean, you've given us an out for one, but in general, do you have a view of that?
I think it depends, again, on your purpose. So I think in general, a great gathering, regardless of the context, is when participation is kind of distributed, but not in a forced way. Like if people should be there, they usually want to participate in some way. I think I wasn't part of the conversation, but perhaps the assumptions behind participation meant talking, and there's many ways to participate in a conversation. It doesn't necessarily have to be a talk. And so in the meeting that I described, they completely changed the dynamic of the meeting because they were extraordinarily powerful listeners and witnesses sitting in this giant circle. And so they had a very specific role. They agreed to their role. And in those cases, it wouldn't have been appropriate for them to talk, but they were participating.
You had some great examples of stories you've bubbled up. You mentioned earlier the range of people you talked to. Could you talk about two I would love you to tease out? One was Jill Soloway. The producer, and her box way of approaching a meeting. Give us that story.
Absolutely. I love this story. So Jill and they go by they. They use the pronoun they, but they are a TV runner, showrunner, and did Transparent and I Love Dick, and these two kind of award-winning Amazon shows. And what the show does is at the beginning of every shoot, they bring out either Jill or somebody else brings out this physical box in the space, and all of the regular stars, but also all of the extras. So again, in terms of who do you include and who don't you include, radical to include extras in this very intimate ritual. And they start clapping, and they go box, 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 and so there's like this verbal interruption. People know what's happening, and basically for 10 to 40 minutes, people hop on the box and share whatever they want to share with the group. And it's basically a way... Does anyone
get pulled off because they talk too much? You let them go as long as you want.
And at some level, when you give people space to talk, and they do it all the time. So there's a discipline that kind of, there's certain communities that have a discipline of gathering, and they gather beautifully. The Quakers are one. So over time, when you start building a muscle of gathering, people self-correct over time. They don't always self-correct in the moment. But sometimes, if there's one person who wants to go on for 25 minutes, I think the community is that is what that actor needed.
And what are they doing on the box? Are they just getting things off their chest?
They're getting things off their chest. They can talk about a scene that they kind of screwed up at the last time. They can talk. Sometimes they speak about, death. A friend died. They speak about anything and everything. But it's kind of a way of like warming things up.
Yeah, it sounds lovely.
And extras have been interviewed about this process. And one of them, when they were filming I Love Dick, she worked at a local bank, and she was an extra. And she, at least as a reporter, she sort of got very emotional as she got up on the box, and she said, "This is amazing. I don't even belong here, but this feels like a family." And I love this example because it's a physical kind of ritual. It's authentic to them. I'm not saying everybody should do box, but we can learn from the principle of it. And it just kind of gets everybody present and connected very quickly. And it embodies for Jill, the principles of what they are trying to get out in the scene. So the scenes, Transparent is one of the most incredibly authentic, live, pushing the boundaries show. And I don't think that it necessarily is unrelated to the idea that they start in this way.
Yeah, it's such a great example. We're taking questions. We're live here on Facebook. We're from WeWork in New York City. We're on the Hudson Street location. To that point, we had a question come in from Una. I'm sorry, Una, if I'm getting your name wrong. Una Rokyata. And Una says, to that point, how do you then translate that a bit for Una's question? She says, how do you create a company-wide culture of gathering as part of the reason we are in business, rather than just about meetings to share information and meetings to make people check up on what they're doing?
Yeah, it's a beautiful question. And one of the reasons I think gathering is so powerful is because it is a form of power. And it is also a form of love and taking care of people. And
I don't think many people watching this feel that way about the meetings. I didn't feel that way about my meetings at work. I mean, there were some I loved. I loved the people, but I didn't love the meetings.
I agree. And one of the things, if you want to create a company culture where gatherings matter, have gatherings that are focused on the core issues of the organization, have gatherings that are focusing on the operations and the systemic structures and setups of the gathering. But in terms of leadership, one of the things that leaders should be doing is modeling what good gathering actually looks like. And so, to me, some of the companies that are really pushing the boundaries are the ones that have transparent, share their numbers with the entire company, and have, in a way, a gathering that models, powerful, authentic conversation around things that they don't know what's going to happen in the meeting, right? So we need to bring risk back into meetings. These should not be rubber stamp meetings where you're kind of saying everything has happened beforehand and you're meeting to kind of as a show. People can sniff that out, but it's also fundamentally saying, we don't trust you. We don't feel safe here. And so to the Una's question, to begin to have meetings that are witnessed by other people, in which by discussing what you're discussing in front of them, you're implicitly also saying, we're trusting you.
Speaking of trust, you talked about a very formative meeting you participated when you were at the Harvard Kennedy School. Talk about that. It was the CAN meeting. I actually would love to put this into a setting. I think it's really great.
Well, you should do it. So it was started by a woman named Lisa Lazarus. She was 1 sort of year above me at the Kennedy School. And at the Kennedy School, as I think in a lot of graduate school or college settings, you go in and regardless of where you are, it's a very intimidating environment. And and this is true in a conference, most people, when they walk into an intimidating environment, we puff up rather than kind of show our real selves. We wear these masks.
Or you hide in the wall like I do. I hope they don't see me.
Exactly, by like the peanuts. And Lisa decided that this was a sort of a terrible way to build community. She came because of these amazing people, but we were all kind of showing our, our press-ready selves. And so she started this gathering called CAN, and she'll joke herself, it's like a terrible name, but it started, and actually related to your name of your book club, it stood for Change Agents Now, and she wanted to
She
wanted to change the culture, to Una's question, of how we related to each other in the classroom and the hallways. And so she created this process where groups of 6 people, it was voluntary, you sign up, and there was a curriculum based somewhat on Bill George's True North books, and every week or every 2 weeks, we'd gather for 3 hours, and we started by rotating and taking turns in the groups of 6 by sharing our life stories and our kind of crucible moments, the moments that made us who we are, which are usually moments of pain. And completely shifted the dynamic quite radically because a lot of people were part of these groups. And so it was a beautiful experience, and Lisa is actually also, she was a moderator in Sustained Dialogue at Princeton, which is how I was trained as well at UVA. And so I think one of the things that, as I interviewed different people for the book, is gathering well as a habit and a practice. And I want to kind of destroy the belief or the assumption that some people gather well and some people don't. That's true, but I think like the movie Ratatouille, everyone can cook. I love that movie. Everyone can gather.
Well, we crave it, and I think perhaps as I hear you talk, maybe the reason we keep craving new engagements is because it's not being done well. We're not getting that meaning. I think that's what you're saying. So we're hearing, as I mentioned, we're here at WeWork, which is a company that's set up in many ways about the way people gather. You see companies more and more creating spaces for people to gather differently. Give us a sense of space. What are some tips you've learned about how to think about where people gather?
Yeah, space deeply, deeply matters. And one of the things that I learned, particularly from the people that I interviewed, is the idea of displacing people. So again, the idea, one of the problems, routine and autopilot is sort of the enemy of gatherings in any part of life.
Yeah.
We go in and we sit in a specific,
you're so right.
We sit in a specific spot.
Why do we sit in the same chair?
We sit in the same chair.
Yeah.
You sit, and it's based on hierarchy, or it's
Yeah.
based on comfort, or it's based on who's been here long enough. And simply actually switching chairs in a conflict resolution at a moment in a group dialogue when we're stuck, the facilitators actually we'll change the name cards to physically change people's perspective.
Okay, I love that. I think that's an assignment for everybody watching, to take one action of change making to just mess up the seating assignment at your next meeting.
Absolutely, and a couple other just physical tips is, when possible, circles are very powerful. There's a great book called The Circle Way. This is not new information. If you're a facilitator, you're probably saying, like, of course the circle is powerful. Yeah. But even though we know that, we tend to accept the setup we're given. So whether it's a table or whether it's like you walk into a place and the chairs are set up kind of in classroom style, change the setup. And so again, we assume that there's thought that goes into the way a room is set up. And there usually isn't. We're usually on autopilot. So as much as possible, create environments where you're facing each other. You're literally looking at each other in the eye. And that's true for conferences. I mean, whenever I do any type of gathering, if possible, and it kind of drives people who set up the room crazy, I'll do layers of circles, just because it completely shifts the dynamic, because you have to look up and see each other.
You're also big on taking people to go see for themselves, to go discover. As I hear you talking, I remember one of my meeting mishaps early on was I took a group of engineers to an art museum, like, let's be creative. It was a disaster. One, we didn't really have the purpose right. We hadn't really thought through, I mean, how do you get people to go someplace and find meaning together?
Why was it a disaster?
It was a disaster because I think we were just like, we're going to be creative, so we're in a museum, as opposed to thinking, how do we facilitate an experience and translate it in a way. A similar group we then took to a NASCAR pit crew, and they learned all about servicing engines, and that was very relevant, but it required thought. And I think the learning was, you just can't say be creative and go to a space that didn't mean anything.
And I love that example, because in a way what you did is you associated form with an idea. So you thought creativity, art museum, and you push them together, which I commend you for trying. I mean, by the way, I have had many, many, many disasters. I still have disasters all of the time. So part of the reason I wrote this book is to kind of have the courage to keep trying and trying again. And so the fact that you took me to the museum, I'd say bravo, like, what an amazing beginning. And one of the things I would say in terms of engaging people is, as much as possible, don't set, so a gathering, to my mind, when we think of a gathering as the people in the gathering being an audience and something having been a form of entertainment, it's a very difficult experience to have it be meaningful, because then the entertainment has to be extraordinarily moving. And so you can do that, but leave it to the kind of the experts. In every other situation, figure out an experience that would tap into their form of of creativity. So one of the books I love about this is Tina Seelig. She writes a lot about creativity and tapping into teams. She's a professor at Stanford, and she has this great exercise where I may miss it up a little bit, but she sends out her students to figure out how they can make the most amount of money in an hour. And forgive me if this isn't exactly the right example. And she gives everybody $1 in an envelope. And they think, how can we
take a dollar and turn it into
take a dollar and turn it into as much as you can. And they go out and they span around and they're trying to figure it out. And long story short, the kids who the students who make the most money realize that the dollar is actually a constraint, right? And who cares about it all? You can do whatever you don't even need to buy anything to make money. You can stand on the street and sell consulting services to whoever's walking by. But we have this form, and so she creates and designs these experiences, as do a lot of great experience designers, that force us to realize, how do we engage with our own creativity?
And you're shifting people's perspective, their mindset. To that point, we got a question in. I'm sorry, I don't have the name of the person, but ask, how do your principles apply in virtual gatherings? Again, I mean, it's the age of virtual gatherings. We're doing this physically. We're doing this virtually. What have you learned, or what did you find about virtual gatherings?
Yeah, it's a beautiful question. One is that you can think of them as physical gatherings. And so many of the principles still apply. The way you open and the way you close deeply matters. Don't begin on logistics, don't end on logistics. Begin with purpose and begin with connecting with your community and end in the same way. Yeah. The second is to think about virtual gatherings in a way as how can I feel connected to the people even when I can't see them? And how can I physicalize this experience? Yeah. How can I embody it?
How might we do that?
So, for example, if I were to pick up this glass of water, and I don't see the live feed right now, but I would ask everybody else, like, what are you drinking right now? And can we all take a sip?
Oh, that's
right?
Good. Yeah.
That was my trick of like getting some water. Exactly. But there's ways you can actually, toast physically. Another thing is to, like, if you're on a video conference, to have everybody just span out to their window and say, like, what's the view from my window right now? To remember that we actually are still tactile people. Then the last thing I'll say, one of my favorite examples is, I think it was the Move On, right after the election, did a call after the Women's March, and they had 60,000 people dial in to this call. And rather than keeping the 60,000 people on mute, at one point they said, we have 60,000 people on this call, we want you to say hello to each other. And they took the mute button off.
I love that.
And they had sort of one big screen. Yeah. I wasn't on the call, but people send me examples of things. And that's a brilliant way of saying, look who's here.
Yeah, that's very clever. So we have a few minutes left and a couple of questions I want to make sure we get into. This is from Alex Dorr, and Alex says, what's your best tip for when if a meeting is focused more on why we can't or shouldn't instead of how we could? So I think this is calling all your skills as a conflict resolution expert and a meeing wizard.
Yeah.
How do you get people to do something they think they can't or won't do in a meeting, in a gathering?
It's a great question, and the question, what I hear behind the question is, how do you get people out of their fixed mindsets? Yeah. As Carol Dweck writes about the sort of fixed mindsets and anything is possible versus
another great book.
Another great book, or growth mindsets versus fixed mindsets, and you could kind of give them this book or Dan Pink's a whole new mind book, but more simply, you can create some pop-up rules. And some of the examples in the book that I love, one is Paul LaDucina. He used to be the chairman of A.T. Kearney. And he was having a problem in his board meetings where they were in a huge transition. The company was in a bit of crisis and they were trying to turn the ship. And he told me one of the things he realized as board chair were that people were asking, the board members were asking questions that were stalling tactics. Their questions were literally they kept asking for more information.
That's a big one in change. Everybody's like, but I don't understand.
Yeah, exactly. And he realized very wisely that it was a stalling tactic. And so for the next meeting, he made a rule. He said, we're going to send you all of the information up front, ask all of your follow-up questions before the meeting. So he met the need, and he made one rule for that meeting. And he said, the only questions you can ask are questions that get us thinking about a way forward. And so he specifically controlled language. And so similarly there's also a water conference. Actually, my brother-in-law, Tom Ferguson, runs a water incubator in San Francisco. And he shares this example of at a water conference, there was this dynamic. People were like, we can't do that, that's impossible. And so they tried this rule where they basically said, you can't attack an idea, or you can't say why it won't work unless you also in the same breath give an example of how it might work. And again, it just shifts it, and you just do it for 20 minutes. But there's small tweakable ways where rather than getting everybody to change their entire mindset, just hack the meeting. Yeah.
What have you seen, also sort of the theme that came up in some of the discussion earlier was, what about if you're not hosting the meeting, but you want to get a kind of conversation, or you want to get something, in all your days of conflict resolution, I'm sure you've seen that. What advice do you have for people who are stuck in a meeting and they feel they have no control?
Yeah. I mean, it's a very different context whether you're at work or whether you're with friends, because at some level when you're at work, there are just some meetings you have to go to. Yeah. But that said, this book I wrote called The Art of Gathering. I did not call it The Art of Hosting. And a gathering is host and guests. And like the kind of wink in the book is that you can do this as a guest as well. Yeah. And so, a couple of things. One is, related to the idea of like bringing in risk and heat into the conversation is just literally naming what's going on. So some of the best meetings I've been to, even if I'm not facilitating, or dinner parties, is people aren't really connecting, and someone, often not the host as well, this feels a little awkward. why don't we try something? Or in a meeting and saying, guys, this is not what we were talking about in the hallway. Like, let's have a real conversation.
Yeah. So it's back to some of your candor.
Candor and the idea of naming what is.
Naming it.
Yeah.
So we're about out of time. I want to just summarize so much. I highly recommend it. So many useful tips, as well as just it's a thoughtful approach. Like we gather together for a reason.
Yes.
So you talk about purpose. There's a lot of tips that you lay out. You talk about bringing heat, meaning conflict. It's not all just feel good, and we're all so happy to be here.
Yep.
You talk about being very thoughtful in who you invite.
Yep.
So everybody who's watching, most of the people work. If they leave this today and they go to work tomorrow or Monday, what are a couple of things you'd recommend people do? They buy your book, and what would they do to be sort of going forth in the art of gathering as you've put it forward?
So the first thing I would say, and this may be counterintuitive, is meet less.
No, I think that's music to everybody's ears, but it is counterintuitive. What do you mean? So meet less.
Meet less, which is we dilute the power of our gatherings because we think every problem we have can be solved by a gathering, and it shouldn't be. If you're exchanging information, send an email.
Yeah.
And as you meet less, it actually increases people's excitement and need and desire to actually come together. Yeah. And maybe it's making a rule, it's not obviously everyone can do this in a company, that you can only be in a meeting twice a day. All of a sudden, I promise you, those meetings will become much more productive.
It's absurd to think that some people have to have like meeting-free Fridays or something, but
completely.
you're making, back to the earlier question from Una, you're making this more the culture, the way you work. So
completely.
Meet less.
Meet less. The second is as you focus obsessively about the first 5% of the meeting. The milling around time when people come in, that's actually a time where everyone's kind of sniffing out like what's happening here, what side can I show, are we going to really go there or not, is this fun, and host. So get off your live stream problems or your AV tech equipment the second someone walks in and begin hosting them and model the behavior you want them to see. And the third is before you kind of dive into business, spend the first 3 minutes or 5% of the gathering, if you have a full day together or longer than that, connecting people. One of the studies that I love shows that when surgeons meet as a team and they go through a series of checklists, but specifically introduce the entire team ahead of time and people literally talk, the error rates go down in surgery because when something goes wrong and somebody notices it, they're more likely to speak up. And surgical teams are very hierarchical. And so one of the problems is often, somebody on lower in the hierarchy will see something, but because they don't feel comfortable, they won't say anything. And so the way you model the kind of the first 5% of your meeting deeply affects how people will behave for the next hour.
Wow, some great examples. So Priya Parker, The Art of Gathering, a really great way to think about how you spend your time with connecting and working with the people you work with. Thank you for joining us. We've been live on Facebook, and thank you as you've been experimenting on Instagram. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for having
We'll catch you next time. Thank you.